So again, we have a game from Mikhail Tal, the man of Riga. This is the 8th world chess champion, a Latvian Soviet grandmaster. So this is another game which is very interesting, a game between Mikhail Tal and this guy Isaac Babraga, or Obi Braga. So let's see this guy, Mikhail Tal in black, Bibraga in this guy Isaac from in white. So Isaac pushes on the game with the move d4, and then we see this move knight to f6. Then on the board we see c4, of course standard. Then we see the Benoni defense. The Benoni defense comes in handy. Then we see this move d5 from Isaac. Then on the board we see e6, of course opening up, and this is standard for the Benoni defense. And then we see the move knight c3, and that's when we see Mikhail takes and then takes. At this moment we see the move d6, of course reinforcing, and of course getting ready to have a good center in the game. On the board we see e4, of course e4 comes in pretty handy. And also expanding in the center. Of course, expected is the move after sitting up this side. Expected is the move g6, of course, opening up for the bishop. And then we have this fianchetto bishop preparing to castle. Then on the board, we see bishop d3, castles. At this point, everything is pretty standard. On the board, we see Mikhail Tal chooses to go for this move, knight to s6. Knight to s6 is standard, of course. It can always be can always transpose into other variations. And then on the board we see knight falling back to d2, of course planning probably to extend and have f4 on the board. And then at this point we see knight coming in as expected to b4, going for that bishop. The bishop falls back, and then we see the rook to e8. Mikhail always liked this rook to e8 ideas, of course always trying to have a watch on the open file, on the semi-open file. We see the knight kick back, and then we see f3 on the board. The knight goes back to a6, and then on the board we see the move e1, rook to e1. Then we have this knight to c6, knight to c7, and then on the board we see queen to c2. Queen to c2, of course, was coming in at the right time. Of course, everything is pretty standard, keeping an eye on e4, and also always having some control on the c file. Then on the board we see rook to b8 from Tal. This was a great maneuvering game, so nothing so much was very fancy at the start until someone cracked between them. Then we see on the board, we saw from Isaac a move f4. After f4, Mikhail responds with a move b6. Then on the board we see this knight coming to b5, knight b5 on the board, and then from Tal chases away that knight with a move f6. Then we see knight takes knight, and then the queen takes knight. Then on the board we see these small maneuvers. These guys were just having their pieces being maneuvered around slowly as they're trying to improve their positions. On the board from Isaac we see rook to a2, and then from Tal we see the queen to e7. And then Isaac goes with this move f3. And then on the board we see Tal going with the move knight to h5. Since the bishop was now closed, he was confident to go with this move knight to h5. Then on the board we see this move knight to f1, of course having these maneuvers, and the knight is controlling any string attacks from Tal's knight. Then on the board we see pawn to f5. Tal starts his thing, and he starts to try to expand on the king side. Silent attacks on the king side. Of course, this is now into his style. Then we see Isaac going for this move bishop to e3. So we see this move, an extension of the pawn to f4 from Tal, and then the move g4. G4 is the first blunder which comes in the game. This is the game which is not perfect for Tal at this moment. So we see this. We see that this is not the right time for Isaac to really break his king side. Of course, that was very provocative. At this point, this is what Tal was probably provoking. At this moment, we see this move bishop to d4. Bishop to d4, of course, comes in handy with a check and with some tempo, with some great tempo. Of course, Tal's pieces are really now coming into play. Of course, now that's when the king goes to h1. And now at this point, we see the special move, queen to h4. Queen to h4 from Tal is a very timely move. Of course, we know that he's eyeing this rook to e1. Rook to e1 is in danger. Of course, if in case Isaac takes this knight, we see this rook falling. And that's when the rook is saved. At this point, Tal had to go for a very amazing line from the engine. Of course, he would have gone with this sacrifice of the knight. When knight, indeed not even a sacrifice because of the pin. He would have gone for this sacrifice, and if knight takes, then pawn takes, then this game would probably, if queen tries to cut back into the fight, that's when we see the rook coming in, of course, for this pawn, and that's when we see that things would have been quite very solid for Tal. This would have been a better game for Tal, but on the board we didn't see this. On the board we didn't see Tal going for that brave variation. Tal chooses to go for this silent queen to h3. Of course, what we know about Tal, he always played moves that made sense to him, moves that his intuition followed, not moves that were just brute force or engine coerced. So at this point we see that Tal goes for the move queen to h3, and that's when the rook falls back. Then of course he was planning to pick this pawn on f3, which he picks, and then we see knight d2 on board. Knight d2 is a very timely move, and that's when we see Tal getting out his queen from danger. That's when we see the knight coming back. Of course, this knight was really trying to hold the position with the knight going back and forth. The knight comes back for d2. Knight comes back to d2 for the queen. That's when we see Tal also going back to his element of sacrifice and attack. He chooses to sacrifice that queen, leaving that queen in danger. He goes for this move, bishop to g4, leaving that queen in danger. Of course, Isaac couldn't hesitate picking this queen. Knight picks queen and bishop then picks knight. Of course, Tal has lost this queen, and now the advantage, of course, seems to be back in Isaac's hands. But of course, Isaac had to prove his advantage. It wasn't so easy to prove such an advantage against a very violent and attacking player like Tal. So we see this pawn being pushed, of course, trying to get out of this pin and trying to extend himself. Then we see this rook holding this pawn before the knight goes for a strike. The rook holds this pawn first before the knight plans to go for any attacks. Then we see this bishop coming in. This is the final mistake and the blunder. Of course, I realized there was much pressure on board, and finding the right moves was not easy. Beta was at this point. Beta was of course opening up for these pieces, silently being patient and also waiting, making those subtle moves from white. But of course we see that Tal cracks and plays this bishop d2. Bishop goes for bishop e2, which wasn't a very precise move. Of course, it was much pressure, and finding the right moves was not so easy on the board. That's when we see this knight coming in at the right time, going for this check. Of course, the king gets out of danger, and then we see bishop takes rook. The king has to take back, and that's when we see the knight taking the bishop. Of course, at this point, Tal is now punishing Isaac's mistake and inaccuracy, not holding that good position he had got. And then we see that the queen had to take, and that's when we see a fork from the pawn. The queen takes, and after the rook took the pawn, of course this was now really lost for Isaac, and that's when the king takes the rook. The second rook comes in to just check this king, and that's when we see the king falling away to f3. That's when we see this bishop coming in handy, and that's when we see this bishop challenging this bishop. Now Tal really wants these bishops to get off the board, and that's when the rook will come in to either snatch all these pawns and of course easily winning the game. So at this point, of course, Isaac threw in the towel, and this was enough for him for the day. So we shall enjoy more Tal games as we traverse this most attacking chess grandmaster of all time. As we said, maybe we shall have more in the future, but at the moment he's considered to be the most attacking chess player in the chess history. Thanks, and see you in the next game.